a point for a cosmology to exist, first as the pretense for everything going forward, is so that you do not end up with any kind of plot holes, any kind of narrative disjunctions, any kind of things that don't add up. Verisimilitude is the ultimate objective, necessarily therefore. So, in the place of a sufficiency, what kind of cosmology do we want to build? Well, that can come in many answers. We can always have a number of things that could fulfill the role of a cosmology, and you can even have multiple ones going at the same time, depending on what kind of setup you're pursuing. But for us, we are in particular looking for something that will keep the exchange of questioning and answering, as we'll be able to see lower down in its own section. That comes in the form of thesis, which is what a thing is, a statement in a dialogue, a premise, an argument, what have you, a judgment if you want to call it so. There are a number of names that would be appropriate for it. A antithesis, a response, an answer, maybe even what you might think of as a mirror or a resulting thesis coming in the opposite direction. And then finally, a synthesis, a bringing together of the theses into something, a progression of the thesis, and the continuity and proliferation, the propagation of that in a metaphysical context. For those of you who, again, are unfamiliar with the notion of the trivium, this entails grammar, logic or dialectic, and finally rhetoric. And on those individual levels, you have different parts of reason, rationale, and ultimately inference is what it comes down to. Grammar, in the traditional sense of the scholastics or academics, is specifically what you are getting whenever you are looking at the alphabets, the basic ideas, the rawest of concepts, the most prime parts of conception, of epistemology ultimately, of what is to be known before you even consider what you might do with that which is known. In the same way that grammar is the basis of writing, of creating coherent and cohesive ideas linguistically. To be recursive, in the linguistic sense, is to be drawing upon yourself, to be calling back to an earlier iteration, a rule, a meaning, order, or fulfillment of that, and composition. To be reflexive is to self-identify. That is to say, there is a sense of blank is blank, A equals A. And as you'll see down there, it's a tautology. What that means, again, is that 1 equals 1. Tautology coming from the ancient Greek, meaning to repeat oneself in a coarse translation. That is, for instance, this cup is this cup. That would be an ideal. If any of you are familiar with the Platonist ideal forms of a world of forms, a realm of forms, where there is a thingness, something that is the ultimate reference, the ultimate abstract object, the holder of a characteristic in the ultimate, absolute, and supreme sense. That everything outside of that is just an imitation of, and therefore imperfect. It does not perfectly take a form. It does not perfectly, for instance, to come back to what I was saying earlier, this cup is just an imperfect representation of a cup, the ultimate cupness. Well, in the metaphysical sense, that would then mean that if there is such a thing as a perfect, an absolute, an entire, and a whole supreme version of anything, these are it. forerunners of the entire Panotrivium. As it says there, it's the entirety of all that's drawn. It is then the stuff before stuff, the antecedent, the predecessor, the primogen, the mother or the father, if you would like to think of it in such terms. And what these do, as the proto-simogen and the prototaxogen, is that these are the dualities in an indirect sense. They are parallel, they do not intersect, they are separate, but ultimately exist in the same sort of state as panagrammars. Potentiality is essentially where the opportunity lies, where there is an endless amount of things that something can become within its own set, within its own definition, but it is not those things. You might say then that it is the becoming. It is the yet fulfilled, the antecedent, the forerunning, the first before the second. Or you might say the zero, as it is something that does exist as a countable thing, but it is not the one. If you think of a sentence per se, you might think of the space before the letters begin. That is the proto-simogen. In deductivity, it is the process of taking premises that are known to be universal, that are known to be correct no matter what application in specific or particular, and then taking that over to the side and going, because I know that, I can know this. What that is called is a corollary, ultimately, in a particular sense. And that is to say, if you already have the premises as deductions themselves, if they are already known to be true, if they are, as I say, the things that are known already, then you will know from derivation these things. But that does mean that no matter what, assuming those premises are correct, your conclusions will be correct. Well, what is etiology? Well, etiology is the account of causes, the account of starts, in other words, the account of beginnings, or, to wrap it back around, becoming. So you see how this ties into itself. So what then is euaticality looking at it? Well, that would mean that it is the true becoming as a quality or characteristic that can be had. So actuality, well, it is what is there. It is the being, in other words. It is what exists, what is present. It is not the becoming. It is the consequence, the wrapping up into a momentary immediate of potential. Now these then become part of one another in the indirect sense. They are a not cause and effect, but they are a cause and effect, and what exists as a matter of course in a cause and effect. But in order to have that cause and effect in the first place, you have to have some capacity for it to express, some capacity for it to be instead of become. Induction, as in inductivity, is something of an inversion or a contravention of deduction, where deduction is taking your premises that you already have, that you know to be true or believe to be true, and then making corollaries of it, making derivations of it. Induction is taking in all sorts of observations, all sorts of notions, premises, principles, observations, and then creating of those summaries, generalizations, you might think of them as. You don't necessarily know if it is true universally, but you can make a judgment on the particulars. You can make a judgment on what seems to be the course, the flow, the occasion of the action, thus induction. Euonticality, again modeled as you can see not so dissimilar from euaticality, would then be you, true, good, or right, ontos, which is the root of the onticality portion. Ontos meaning being, as in existing, or being in that state of immediacy, that tangibility. Icality, meaning a state or condition of, a characteristic, a quality, if you will, that can be had. So in summary, that would then be true being, a state or condition of true being. Well, subscript essence is, in essence, the concept of writing below. It is of where there exists a, again, parallel. You might think of this in the way of, a line on paper, particularly notebook paper. There being the capacity to write in the upper half and write in the bottom half, the lower half. So then you have the capacity to write beneath. You are creating the foundation, in other words, or something akin to it. The footing, the basis. Rhizome essence then comes into the concept of rhizomes. That is, root stalks. These are the parts of specific kinds of plants. You can think like potatoes, but there are many others, where they do not grow in a single portion. They do not grow from a root and then up and out exclusively. They can break off into rhizomes, as they might be called. Tubers, you can think, though not exactly correct in a botanical sense, but it's a good visual aid. They break off from a whole to form clusters rather than a trunk, a singular base, such that if it is attacked or otherwise interacted with, it's going to affect the entire surrounding body. And then finally, we have quintessence. That is thingness, howness, what a thing is in essence, if you will. Now, that was something that I didn't touch upon in the grammagens, where essence is something that does proceed, as all things do, back to the panagrammars. In specific, howness, as it is substantiated in essence, is then the precise and definite set of features that make the definition of a thing. That is to say, that is the essence. It is the intention, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the notion of intention as part of, or an example of, a definition. That is to say, all of the stuff that you can say makes a definition in specific. All of the things that a thing that falls under the description will have, no matter what. You can have anything in the threefold manifold, whether it is importing your own, though I of course can't do it for copyright reasons, your favorite superhero universe, Marvel or DC, or whether it is trying to role-play out the specific mechanics and the cosmology of Call of Cthulhu, whether it is wanting to bring in characters from Eberron, or the Forgotten Realms, or Greyhawk, whether it is wanting to make possible and real some crazy wild nonsense from anime or mangas, whatever you might want, whatever can be justified linguistically, logically, and metaphysically,